Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Sharpening Report. I am your host, Josh Peck. Did you know that the non-canonical book of Enoch has a prophecy that details all the years of creation, even on into the future apocalypse? And so far, everything that it said has come true. We are going to get into all of that and more right after this. Concerning the economically unstable times that we live in, it is a great idea to convert some of your savings into real money. Now, there is a big difference between real money and what we call money, which is actually just currency. So our dollar is currency, which fluctuates. Real money, on the other hand, like silver, for example, is a store of value over time. The best way to think of it is like this. If you had saved $1,000 in cash back in the late 60s, the late 1960s, that $1,000 would still be $1,000 technically, but it would buy you significantly less today due to inflation. Now, if you had saved that same $1,000 in silver back in the 1960s, today it would be worth around $28,000. So one of the best ways to protect your purchasing power is in real money, more specifically silver. You can buy and have the metal shipped discreetly to your door, and what most people don't know is that you can actually convert your IRA or even a 401k into physical silver rather than having all of your life savings tied up in the paper fiat system, which is subject to hyperinflation. Go to dailyrenegade.com and click on the Cornerstone Assets Metals banner. This is the only company that I personally trust with this kind of thing. Click on that and sign up to get your free silver report today. One of the financial experts will speak with you to find out the best way to protect your savings going forward in these uncertain times. Last week we discussed the Essene calendar, but if you missed that program, don't worry. This one will make sense without it. Now, along with the Essene calendar, the ancient understanding of ages, with the ancient understanding of ages, the Book of Enoch provides us with another way of measuring time. And this isn't as much of a calendar as it is a prophetic formula. However, this formula does encompass the entire 7,000 years of human history. Now, while we may not have fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls that clearly lay out the idea of 2,000-year ages, we do have something from the Book of Enoch showing a totality of 7,000 years. Instead of being split up into 7 1,000-year periods or 4 ages in 3.5 2,000-year periods, human history in Enoch's Apocalypse of Weeks is divided into 10 700-year periods called weeks, with each day equaling 100 years. This prophecy is called Enoch's 10 weeks or Enoch's Apocalypse of Weeks, and we're going to get into all this. And again, what's amazing is you can look throughout human history and see how these have all come true. And I can't wait to tell you where we are in this timeline and what it says about our time right now and the very, very near future. So the prophecy comes from the Book of Enoch, chapters 91 and 93. We do have some fragments of the prophecy from the Dead Sea Scrolls to compare what we have from the Ethiopic version. If we are understanding this correctly, the years of the 10 weeks should be as follows. Now, I'm going to include BC and AD dates, but also the AM dates, which stands for Anno Mundi, or the year of the world, which measures years from creation forward. That's how the Essenes, who were the writers and keepers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's how their calendar worked. So, for example, the year 700 AM would be 700 years after creation. This is how, again, the Dead Sea Scrolls record time. What's amazing about this entire prophecy is its astounding accuracy. And again, while we don't have the complete prophecy in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we do have enough to compare it to the Ethiopic version of Enoch, and they match considerably well. If the parts we have match, it stands to reason that the rest would have matched as well. After all, for the translators of the Ethiopic version to invent the prophecy, they would have to know exactly what parts would be discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls and what parts would be lost to time and degradation, and I don't see any way that that would be possible. So, study of this 10-week prophecy it really can become very extensive and could fill the pages of an entire book all on its own, but we can look at some of the basics to show its accuracy. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide us with week 1, the first half of week 2, the second half of week 7, and weeks 8 through 10 in full. We can fill in the rest of the weeks with the Ethiopic version. And again, we can tell that this is a faithful, a pretty accurate translation because it matches up so well, and because the prophecies still came true. And this would have been well after they were written. So if they weren't correct, that shouldn't have been possible. Now, explaining the first week and part of the second week from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Enoch states, and this is, well, I'll just state it and then I'll say the reference, but when he was delivering his letter, Enoch resumed his speech and said, I, Enoch, was born on the 7th day in the first week, and until my time justice was still strong. After me will come the second week when deceit and violence will increase. And that's 4Q Enoch 3:18 and 24 through 25. Now, some translations, such as the Ethiopian Gias to English, render this passage as if Enoch were saying he was born the 7th in a genealogical line during the first week. The Dead Sea Scroll version says he was born on the 7th day in the first week. Now, this is interesting because, in actuality, both would be correct. If we do the math, we discover Enoch was born in the year 622 AM, which would be on the 7th day in the first week, if each day is 100 years. Also, in accordance with the Ethiopic version, Enoch was the 7th generation from Adam, so either one would be correct. We're given the first few words of the second week from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and to understand what is said about the entire second week, we can look to the Ethiopic version, which is where we will obtain all Ethiopic translations of this prophecy. It says, and after me there shall arise in the second week great wickedness, and deceit shall have sprung up, and in it there shall be the first end. And in it a man shall be saved. And after it is ended, unrighteousness shall grow up, and a law shall be made for the sinners. Enoch 93:4. So this is clearly talking about the events that led up to Noah's flood. Great wickedness was caused by fallen angels mating with human women, which we get from Genesis 6:1 through 4. And there was the first end with the flood. Now, we're not sure what this is. We would assume that the first end would be with the flood. But we're actually not really sure what this is because the flood would have happened in 1656 AM, yet this week concludes in 1400 AM. But it could be, it could still reference the flood. It could be that this was the precursor to the first end. When you think about the flood as like the culmination of all of the events that happened earlier, it could be referring to that. Now, it's also possible that this first end described here doesn't have to do with the world being destroyed by the flood, but instead is referring to the genetic and moral corruption of humanity in the days of Jared, which we get from Enoch 6:6, which would fall within this timeline. Also, the it from after it ended might be talking about the wickedness, or it could be talking about the second week itself. But in either case, this part of the prophecy could be looking ahead a bit past the second week. Noah would be the man who was saved, though rather than describing the flood, this would be referring to him being saved from the fallen angels and Nephilim giants on earth in those days. Unrighteousness rises again, so there is a law for sinners, which might be what Noah was preaching about during this time, according to 2 Peter 2:5, before the flood was announced. So when we look at the timeline, we have a couple possibilities. It is all basically referring to the same thing. I mean, a lot of times you could look at the original incursion of angels mating with human women all the way up to the end of the flood is kind of one big event. Like it's like one big thing. Like how you can look at the tribulation period as one big event, one 7-year tribulation, even though a lot of things happen and it builds up a lot. So it just depends on how dialed in, how focused in you are into a certain prophecy. Now, for week 3, the book of Enoch states, "And after that, in the 3rd week, at its close, a man shall be elected as the plant of righteous judgment, and his posterity shall become the plant of righteousness forevermore." That's Enoch 93:5. Now, since this only discusses the close of the 3rd week, it could be that the description of the 2nd week bled over a bit into the beginning of the 3rd. And if this is happening, we could consider the 2nd and 3rd weeks together, in which case we could include the flood. So near the close of the 3rd week, the only man this could be referring to is Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. This also tells us that the term plant of righteousness, which will come up later, has to do with the Jewish people. And again, that's important to know because it'll come up later. And with that bleeding through thing, don't let that throw you, because as we discussed last week, that happens with ages as well. You have this in the Dead Sea Scroll calendar of the 7,000 years. You have this same kind of bleeding through of ages. Like, according to the Essenes, the age of Torah technically ended in 75 AD, and that would have been when the sacrificial system was finally forever abolished. But we would say that the next age, the age of grace, that began probably around 32 AD with the death and resurrection of Christ and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit and all of that stuff. So it's while calendars do have specific dates, that doesn't mean that those events are necessarily going to fall exactly on that date. And in last week's video, I likened it to, if you're planning a birthday party or something. You're going to have a party at Friday at 3 o'clock. Well, that whole week, you're going to be planning for it. Tuesday, you get the presents. Wednesday, you might hire the performers or whatever attractions you're going to have at the birthday party. Thursday you might pick out your music. Right before the party on Friday, you might get your cake. So it's all preparation, but it's in preparation so that on that time everything should be in place for the next stage to begin. So it's kind of like how we know there's a future kingdom, but there's a lot of times that Jesus will refer to us as like we're in the kingdom now, and it's like, you're citizens of it, but you're not there yet. It's like if you can have dual citizenship somewhere, but you can be a citizen of, say, Spain or something, but if you have dual citizenship and you live in America, it doesn't change your citizenship. You're still a citizen of Spain, but you're just living in America. So it's like that. So we are in the kingdom. We're citizens of the kingdom right now, and but that's and again, don't let those terms confuse you, because there's this whole kingdom now. I would consider it a heresy that's going on nowadays that I personally would stay away from, because they say that our whole goal is to bring in the kingdom on earth, and that's totally missing the point. But anyway, so I'm kind of going on a rabbit trail there, but so don't let that bleeding through effect throw you off. That does happen sometimes. Okay, so describing week 4, Enoch says, "And after that, in the 4th week, at its close, visions of the holy and righteous shall be seen, and a law for all generations, and an enclosure shall be made for them." Enoch 93:6. So the events that best fit this description within this time are the Exodus and the giving of the law of Moses and the children of Israel. Moses saw visions of the holy and righteous upon Mount Sinai, the law for all generations, that could be the Torah, and the enclosure is most likely referring to the tabernacle or the first entrance of the promised land by the children of Israel, since that falls within this time period as well. Now, also, somebody might look at that all generations line and say, oh, well, that's just further evidence that we, during our time, the age of grace, we need to be following the Torah. In Hebrew, there's a lot of times where Hebrew, it gets translated to English as like all generations or eternal generations. And when you look at the Hebrew, and I don't know why it got translated like that, maybe in Old English, like it had a different meaning, but when you look at the Hebrew, A lot of times it means for like just a long time, not necessarily forever and ever and ever and ever. And there's an excellent, I think it's by Robert Thomas. There's an excellent two-part Bible study on the Book of Revelation that gets into that. Also, I wrote about that in Lost Prophecies of Qumran, and I don't have the sources in my mind right now because I wrote that a couple of years ago, but it's all in there. So don't let that throw you. It's just weird translational stuff that happens sometimes. Now, next, Enoch says about week 5, and after that, in the 5th week, at its close, the house of glory and dominion shall be built forever. Enoch 93:7. Now, this could be describing Solomon's temple, which would have been around 29:35 a.m. However, it says at its close. It's most likely referring to the second temple, which would have been in 34:08 a.m. And this could also have something to do with Israel itself rather than only the temple. And again, I want to emphasize this, that in Hebrews, this is another one of those where the word forever, it doesn't necessarily mean a never-ending span of time, but it can mean like a dispensation of time. And again, I do develop that idea further in my book, The Lost Prophecies of Qumran, from a Dead Sea Scroll called Psalms of Exorcism. But since it applies to this prophecy as well, it should be mentioned here. Therefore, we don't necessarily only need to look for some kind of house that still exists, though it could be that, but we can also include something that was built for a dispensation of time, and the temple would fit that description. Now, week 6, Enoch states, and don't worry, we are going to get into, like, we're going to get more deeply into all this, so it sounds like I'm running through them fast, but the later weeks are what's really interesting, because that gets more into past the time of the writing. Because so far anybody could say, well, yeah, of course they could predict this stuff, because Enoch was, a lot of people believe that Enoch was written probably around like 200 BC or something like that. And it may have been earlier. It could have been. There's a lot of debate. What we have now could be copies from older texts, or it could have been originally written then. There's just a lot there. But what I find interesting are the parts where it gets past where we know that it was written, and it's predicting stuff that actually happened. So, okay, so concerning week 6, Enoch says, and after that in the 6th week, all who live in it shall be blinded, and the hearts of all of them shall godlessly forsake wisdom. And in it a man shall ascend, and at its close the house of dominion shall be burnt with fire, and the whole race of the chosen root shall be dispersed. Now, that's pretty specific, and probably many of you already know what that is. I'm going to get into it, but again, this is where this gets really interesting. Now, again, remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written at least 100 or 200 years before Christ. Nobody says that those were written after, like, no one. And some of the Dead Sea Scrolls were probably even older than that. It might, like I said, it might be easy to invent everything before the 6th week. However, the Qumran community would have had the Book of Enoch prior to the birth of Christ, prior to the destruction of the temple, and prior to the scattering of the Jewish people among the nations. Yet, as we can plainly see, this is what's being described in week 6. This is also where we make the switch from BC to AD in our current system of recording years. So with that, I want to read that one more time, and just keep in mind, they had this for at least a couple of hundred years before any of this happened. That would be like if we found some, ancient texts from, George Washington or something, and then he's talking about the internet, and he's talking about all, like, really specific, all of this stuff. So let me read that again. And again, remember, they had this a couple hundred years. It's just amazing. And after that, in the 6th week, all who live in it shall be blinded. That's talking about the apostasy that happens at the end of each age. The hearts of all of them shall godlessly forsake wisdom. I just read through the Gospels and the Pharisees, and that clearly happened. And in it a man shall ascend, that's Jesus, and at its close, and of course that's Jesus' ascension into heaven, and at its close the house of dominion shall be burnt with fire. That's the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And the whole race of the chosen root shall be dispersed. And that happened. All the Jewish people were dispersed out of Israel. So all of that happened. This is where things start getting really interesting for me. It's just amazing to know that they had that for so long before that. And yeah, it's just amazing. I love prophecy so much. Okay, next, and probably the most difficult to identify and requires its own section in this video is week 7. And I kind of have a story about this because I wrestled with this one for years. So the Ethiopic version states this: and after that, in the 7th week, shall an apostate generation arise, and many shall be its deeds, and all its deeds shall be apostate. And at its close shall be elected the elect righteous of the eternal plant of righteousness, to receive sevenfold instruction concerning all his creation. That's Enoch 93, verses 9 through 10. Now, what we have from the Dead Sea Scroll version states this: but all their deeds will be at fault. At its close, the chosen ones will be selected as witnesses of the justice from the plant of everlasting justice. They shall be given wisdom and knowledge sevenfold. They shall uproot the foundations of violence and the work of deceit in it, in order to carry out justice. And that's 4Q Enoch 4:11 through 14. So as we can see, we're given a little extra information in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Many have assumed that verse 9 from the Ethiopic version is talking about the Catholic Church in the Dark Ages, and that could be. However, Islam was also founded during this time, so we'd have to consider that as a possibility as well. Now, to narrow it down, we have to identify the other group mentioned, called chosen ones, who are selected as witnesses of the justice from the plant of everlasting justice, according to the Dead Sea Scroll version. The Ethiopic version translates this as the elect righteous of the eternal plant of righteousness. Now, remember from week 3, the plant of righteousness has to do with Abraham and the Jewish people. Therefore, we should be able to find a sect of Jewish people who were called out from many Jews during this time. And this should also have had something to do with wisdom and knowledge, or an instruction concerning his creation. And it should be a substantial change from the norm at the time, since it's described as a sevenfold instruction, and wisdom and knowledge sevenfold. Now, months before writing my book, The Lost Prophecies of Qumran, where much of this information comes from, I was really puzzling over this prophecy, and I really couldn't figure it out. I believed that it might have somehow involved Catholicism at that time, and perhaps the iconoclast movement having to do with idolatry, since it was occurring then. When I was researching this, though, I only had access to the Ethiopic version, and I wasn't aware of the slight differences and additions found in the Dead Sea Scroll version. I even emailed my good friend Dr. Ken Johnson, who's just an expert at Dead Sea Scrolls. He's phenomenal. About what I was thinking at the time. And though, admittedly, I wasn't convinced of it fully myself, but here's an excerpt from that email. I'm just going to read it to you. So I wrote to Ken: the only thing I can find that remotely fits this is the Second Council of Nicaea, which had 7 sessions, each one ending with a determination, so literally 7 distinct teachings or instructions, and it all related to the veneration of icons, or what we might go as far as to say the veneration of worship of idols. The second commandment says not to make, worship, or serve any graven images of any in heaven, earth, or in the sea, basically all of creation. Now, the Second Council of Nicaea determined the veneration of icons was acceptable, but what if the ones who determined that were part of the apostate generation, and the instruction that the righteous were receiving concerning all of creation was a bad instruction from the apostates about icons / idols? Is it possible the instruction the righteous received does not come from God and is not a good instruction? So it's just an excerpt from the email. But after I sent that email, I knew I needed more study, but at the time I felt I had exhausted all of my options. The initial interpretation I came up with didn't seem exactly right, but I didn't know where else to look at that time. Now, I've learned throughout the years that the best thing to do in those situations is to put it in prayer, leave it to the Lord, and wait on Him to reveal the answer if He chooses. So that's what I did. Now, months later, up until actually the day before the time that I was writing this part of this chapter in my book, I was preparing to write this. So this happened the day before. So the end of the workday had come. the next day I was going to write this section on week 7, and I was thinking, oh no, I don't know what to do. And I thought normally, and I didn't feel any pressure to like make anything up. What I would have done if nothing else was revealed to me, I would have just wrote it the way that I just read it to you there. I would have said, this is the best I can come up with. I don't think it's complete. It might not even be right, but I don't know. And I would have just admitted that in the book. I've done that in my whole writing career, and I've never gotten any backlash from that. Actually, but I've seen other authors who don't really know, and they'll just make stuff up, and people don't tend to like that for obvious reasons. If I as an author and a teacher, if I don't know something, I need to be honest and tell you guys that. It's irresponsible to just guess. So the end of the workday had come, but I knew the following day, again, I would have to tackle this week 7. And I always felt that the icon/idol interpretation wasn't satisfactory. So I didn't want to offer that as a valid interpretation in the book. And I was ready, again, to just simply admit that I had no idea what the interpretation was and then move on to week 8. But that night, I was relaxing in bed, getting ready to sleep for the night, and I turned on a series that I had been watching during my downtime by Dr. Chuck Missler, a brilliant Bible teacher who went home to be with the Lord in May of 2018. The series was on the book of Colossians, of all places. It had absolutely nothing to do with the book of Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or really any other subject addressed in my book. So I was about halfway through the series, around the 4th or 5th session, and then suddenly, seemingly at random, but it seemed too precise to be just chance, the answer to Enoch's 7th week appeared on the screen. At least I believe so. Now, the funny thing is, Dr. Missler wasn't teaching anything about the book of Enoch, and there was no indication that he even knew his teaching had anything to do with this prophecy. So I quickly paused the television after his explanation, turned to my wife and said, that's it. That's Enoch's 7th week. And I quickly made note of it in my phone for the following day, then turned the session back on. About an hour later in the next session, another interesting bit of seemingly coincidental teaching came up. Dr. Missler started describing a practice that every Christian should begin doing, considering a familiar Bible verse. John 14:26 says, but the Comforter, which is the Holy Ghost, whom the Father will send in my name, he shall teach you all things and bring all things to your remembrance whatsoever I have said unto you. So Dr. Missler suggested that anytime we come across an unfamiliar verse in the Bible and don't know what it means, we should pray to God for the answer, remind him of his promise in John 14:26, and wait. He then suggested keeping a record of the verse in a personal journal for later use. He said it likely will not happen right away, but eventually God will reveal the answer, and most likely he'll do it in an unexpected way, such as in an overheard conversation or a thought that occurs while eating dinner. Somehow, he said, God will provide the answer. And when he does, Dr. Missler said, we should find that spot in the journal with our original question and write under it how God taught us the answer. And this is because there will be times when we as Christians go through doubts and difficult times. And when those times come, we can pick up that journal and read through the many ways that God has tutored us throughout our lives. Now, unbeknownst to Dr. Missler, he just happened to say this right after he inadvertently gave me the answer to a question that I had been spending months trying to find. Now, Dr. Missler recorded those sessions over a decade before God used them in my life, as I'm sure he's used them in various ways throughout an untold number of lives, all of you out there, since the time of their recording. And because of this, I decided to take Dr. Missler's advice, and I recorded this whole story in my book, hoping that, and that's why I'm putting it in this video as well, hoping that it will, not only be an encouragement to me, should I ever run into my own season of doubt, but also that it could be an encouragement to all of you, all you others out there as well. We may not always be able to recognize how God is teaching us throughout our lives, but we can be assured that he is. We also may never know how God is working through our lives for the benefit of other people, but we can be certain that if we follow his desires rather than our own, he can use that obedience in amazing and really impactful ways. Dr. Missler was discussing the history of the Karahite Jewish movement. He was explaining how they were formed and what they stood for. I realized this was an excellent fit to week 7 of Enoch's prophecy. And in writing it in my book, I found it funny that I had briefly mentioned a possible connection with the Karaite Jews and Sadducees in a previous chapter of my book, which, at the time of writing this video, this was a couple years ago, but had I continued on that trail, I might have come to the answer of Enoch's seventh week way back then, but the Lord has his perfect timing for everything. Um, and if I had found it then, I wouldn't have this Dr. Chuck Missler story to tell, and that can be really encouraging to people. That stuff is encouraging to me. Um, Now there is some debate as to when the Karaite Judaism movement first sprung up, but most agree it gained substantial foothold somewhere between the 7th and 9th centuries, which would fit perfectly within the time frame of Enoch's seventh week. As one publication words it, quote, led by a Nasi, or prince, claiming Davidic lineage, the Karaites attracted many scholars of distinction in biblical exegesis, law, Hebrew lexicography, and philosophy, end quote. Now, originally, the Karaite Judaism branched off from mainstream Talmudic Judaism of the time. They absolutely rejected the notion of oral Torah. Instead, they preferred to recognize the written Torah as the supreme authority in religious law and theology, even borrowing some of their traditions and interpretations from the Essenes, among other ancient Jewish groups. It's also believed that Karaite Judaism formed as a reaction to Islam, and this leaves us with a couple of options for how to interpret week 7. If Islam is the prophesied apostate generation, and if Karaite Judaism rose up as a reaction to it, then the Karaite Jews could be the elect righteous of the eternal plant of righteousness. Now, this wouldn't mean that they themselves were righteous in the sense of following Christ. Rather, compared to what Jews in general, the plant of righteousness, were doing by following the mainstream precepts of Judaism, elevating oral Torah and the Talmud above the Torah, the Karaites could be the called out ones elected to resist Islam, go back to Torah only, and through that receive their sevenfold wisdom and knowledge. This would have been a much greater amount of wisdom and knowledge compared to that which was found in Talmudic Judaism of the time. Now, on the other hand, there might be a simpler explanation. The apostate generation of verse 9 from the Ethiopic version might not be describing Islam or even Catholicism at all. Instead, it might be describing Talmudic Judaism itself. Remember, as Talmudic Judaism sprang up after the destruction of the temple in AD 70. It was formed from surviving Pharisees. And when we look throughout history, ancient Pharisees were certainly violent. I mean, one only needs to read through the pages of the four Gospels to discover that fact. Therefore, Pharisees and any group developing from them would have had a tradition and history of violence. If Talmudic Judaism, which was formed from ancient Pharisaical Judaism, is the apostate generation, then it would make sense how the Karaite Jews could fulfill the rest of the prophecy. Not only were they given a sevenfold instruction concerning all of creation, which would be gained by putting the Torah, including the creation account in Genesis, above Talmudic interpretations and traditions, but by rejecting the traditions of the Pharisee turned Talmudic Jews, they would also fulfill the last part of the Dead Sea Scroll version, which states again, they shall uproot the foundations of violence and the work of deceit in it in order to carry out justice. The foundation of violence and works of deceit would describe the Pharisees. By rejecting Talmudic traditions, the Karaite Jews would have been uprooting that Pharisaical foundation. Other translations render that final part as to pass judgment on it, rather than carry out justice. And given that, we can see how Karaite Jews passed judgment on Talmudic Judaism. As one online source explains, quote, the best part of the Karaite intellectual effort was directed at proving the errors of the rabbinates. Their critical acuteness and thorough knowledge of rabbinical doctrines ensured the high level of their polemics, and their religious attack was accompanied by bitter social criticism of the Jewish leadership, the exilarchs, the geonim, which is the heads of the academies, and the dignitaries which surrounded them, end quote. Therefore, in my opinion, and it still is just an opinion, But in my opinion, Enoch's seventh week is likely not describing Catholicism or Islam, though admittedly that's still a possibility. Rather, I think it's far more likely that the entire seventh week is regarding the rise of the Karahite Judaism movement, the elect righteous from the eternal plant of righteousness, or called out ones from mainstream Judaism, which God used to pass judgment against Talmudic Judaism, the apostate generation. And he did this by offering Karahite Jews a sevenfold instruction, wisdom and knowledge through the Torah instead of Talmudic traditions. And in fact, we can even see historically that Karahite Jews, because they were so different and set apart, they enjoyed protections that Talmudic Jews did not. So it's possible this was part of a judgment from God against Talmudic Judaism in a similar way that the destruction of the temple was a judgment against the Pharisees and Sadducees. Deciding to go back to the Torah and rejecting Talmudic tradition could have been enough for the Karahite Jews to escape that particular judgment. So, in my opinion, the theological battle between Talmudic and Karahite Judaism seems to be the most likely fulfillment of Enoch's seventh week. Now that the mystery of the seventh week has hopefully been uncovered, in my opinion, we can move on to the eighth. The Ethiopic version states, "And after that there shall be another, the eighth week, that of righteousness, and a sword shall be given to it, that a righteous judgment may be executed on the oppressors, and sinners shall be delivered into the hands of the righteous. And at its close they shall acquire houses through their righteousness, and a house shall be built for the great king in glory forevermore." Enoch 91:12-13. The Dead Sea Scroll version reads like this: "After this, the eighth week will come, and the one of justice, in which a sword will be given to all the just, for them to carry out just judgment against the wicked, who will be delivered into their hands. At its close, they will gain riches in justice, and there will be built the temple of the kingship of the Great One in his magnificence for all eternal generations." 4Q Enoch 4:15-18. Now, as we can see, these translations are similar. We have, during this time, we have the Crusades happening, and at least in part, and European Christians were fighting against the oppression of Muslims. The success of the First Crusade occurred in AD 1099, right at the beginning of Enoch's eighth week. Now, to be clear, the accuracy of this prophecy wouldn't necessarily justify every action of every human being during the Crusades, because it is such a contested and debated topic. Attempting to find out exactly what happened can be challenging. Each modern and historical source seems to have its own bias. Especially today, sources try to paint the Crusades in either the best or the worst light possible. And it's entirely possible that God had his plans accomplished through this time, but fallible human beings took it much too far and began operating outside of the will of God. However, the prophecy of week 8 mentions the righteous. Can God consider sinful men as righteous? Of course. This is one of the main tenets of Christianity. We are considered righteous not by our own acts, but by the blood of Jesus, which washes away all sin. Now, that's not an excuse to sin. Rather, it's a remedy for the fallen state of man. In fact, as we discover when reading through the Bible, God has a habit of working through imperfect human beings. So Lot, according to Genesis, he was extremely carnal. He offered his daughters to a ravenous mob in Genesis 19:1-11, and even entered into an incestuous sexual relationship with his daughters after getting drunk. That's Genesis 19:30-38. But Lot was considered righteous by biblical standards. And if he, and here's where we get this. Here's from 2 Peter 2:7-8. "And if he rescued Lot, a righteous man in anguish over the debauched lifestyle of lawless men, for while he lived among them day after day, that righteous man was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard." So how can this be? It's because our righteousness isn't measured by our actions, but by our faith. In the Old Testament, we see that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. We get that from Genesis 15:6. So today, the only difference between the believer and the unbeliever is the blood of Christ that washes away our sins. And because of that, we're considered righteous despite those sins. So continuing on, the second part of the week 8 prophecy seems to be about the Protestant Reformation. Now, this is interesting because in week 7, the Jewish people had their own type of rebellion against man-made traditions in favor of biblical text by itself. And near the end of week 8, Martin Luther rebelled against the Catholic Church and perpetuated a movement of Christianity that also rejected man-made traditions in favor of biblical text by itself. It's interesting how that mirrors. The temple or houses in the prophecy likely refers to the body of Christ, since believers are described as temples in the Bible. 1 Corinthians 6:19 says, "What, know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own?" 2 Corinthians 5:1-3 says, "For we know that if our earthly house, the tent we live in, is dismantled, we have a building from God, a house not built by human hands, that is eternal in the heavens. For in this earthly house we groan, because we desire to put on our heavenly dwelling, if needed. After we have put on our heavenly house, we will not be found naked." So when we put Christ first and truly follow him, we together become his temple. Each Christian becomes a house to the Lord. So winning souls to the Lord through faith instead of works can easily fulfill the part of the prophecy that says we, Christians, will acquire houses through their righteousness. The temple that is built for the Lord would be the whole body of believers in Christ who trust him for salvation rather than their own works. Now, I want to make a distinction here. I would not apply that understanding to the third temple that we see talked about in Daniel and Revelation. And there's a whole host of reasons why that I'm not going to get into in this video, but if that's something that you want me to explore in a future video, I'm happy to do so. But I believe that's actually going to be a physical building because it's described in physical terms. Week 9. Now, week 9 is exciting because this begins to explore a future time from our own. The Ethiopic version says, "And after that, in the 9th week, the righteous judgment shall be revealed to the whole world, and all the works of the godless shall vanish from all the earth. And the world shall be written down for destruction, and all mankind shall look to the path of uprightness." And that's Enoch 91:14. The Dead Sea Scrolls version states, "And after that, the 9th week, in it will be revealed justice and just judgment to all the sons of the whole earth. And those who act wickedly will vanish from all the whole earth, and they shall be hurled into the eternal well. All men will see the just eternal path." 4Q Enoch 4:19-22a. It is probably obvious that this is referring to the return of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. This week occurs between the years AD 1675 and AD 2375. Now, what's interesting is the exact midpoint of week 9, half of 700 is 350, so 350 years after 1675, is 2025, next year. This is, as we discussed in last week's video, the beginning of the final jubilee of our age of grace before the kingdom age is supposed to begin according to the Dead Sea Scroll calendar. Now, is this just a coincidence? Time's getting close. Time's running short. Now, when I first came across this, I wanted to see if there was any indication that something is unique about this week. So I wanted to know if there was any reason beyond just the interest in the year 2025 to read this prophecy this way, to look at the midpoint. I wondered if we should expect the events of this prophecy to occur, at the midpoint, and why would we read this week like this and not any of the others? But then I noticed the detail, because I wanted to test myself. I didn't want to just see a coincidence and to get excited about it. I wanted to test it and make sure it was at least a likely possibility. But then I noticed a detail about how the time frames within the weeks are described. There is a commonality among almost all the weeks that week 9 does not share. Most describe something happening at the close of a week. However, week 9 doesn't suggest whether these events will happen at the beginning, middle, or near the close of the week. So this made me wonder if any other week has a similar lack of description about the timing. The first week gives us an idea of the timing. Enoch says that he was born on the 7th day in the first week. So this would have correlated to between 600 and 700 a.m. And in fact, he was born in 622 a.m., so that's accurate. The second week, much like the ninth, does not offer us any kind of timeline. The only thing we know is a man, presumably Noah, will be saved through what we can assume is the sin of the Watchers and eventual genetic and moral corruption of the entire world. Chapter 6 of the book of Enoch tells us that this event began in the days of Jared. Enoch 6:6 says, "And they were in all 200 who had descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn to bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it." And that's talking about the fallen angels that came down, the Watchers. So the days of Jared would have been between the years 460 a.m. and 1422 a.m., since that is when Jared was born and died. We know the second week would be between 700 and 1400 a.m., so this fits in really well. Also, for a man to be saved in it, it stands to reason he would need to have been already born. Noah was born in 1056 a.m. Now, note that the halfway point between 700 and 1400 is 1050. The year 1050 a.m. is the exact halfway point of week 2. Therefore, when we're not offered a description of a specific time, such as the close or the seventh day, we have something that seems to point to roughly the middle of the week, in which Noah, that's when Noah was born. 1056 and 1050, that's pretty close. Now, again, and a lot of these you can't get an exact year, so I'm not going to say that anything's going to happen in 2025 exactly, but around that time, if all of these prophecies, not just from the book of Enoch, but all the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, everything we talked about last week, everything in the Bible, and because you can apply the Dead Sea Scroll calendar to the Bible and map things out pretty well. But that's so close. I mean, that's within 6 years. So it seems like, again, I'll repeat it. All the other weeks, except 2 and 9, have an indication of the timing of the week, and it's usually at its close, But 2 and 9 are the only ones that are worded where it's not like that. And when you look at 2, it's referencing something in the middle of the week, Noah. So in week 9, it would stand to reason that it would be the same deal. And in the middle of that is 2025. So again, just to reiterate, I know we're talking about a lot of numbers and this is kind of confusing. So weeks 3 through 8. 1 and 10 are unique too, but just weeks 3 through 8, all the middle ones, they all have something pointing to the end of the week with the phrase at its close. Week 9 doesn't contain a hint of the timing within the description of the week. Lastly, week 10 describes the 7th part. The only 2 weeks that do not offer us a time frame are week 2 and week 9. Week 2 seems to contain a reference that could be pointing to the halfway point with Noah. So could it be that if timing is not offered in the prophecy, that it's meant to be understood as describing events that will occur in the middle of the week? And if so, could we begin to see fulfillment of Enoch's 9th week, either exactly or roughly halfway through, or in or around our year of 2025? Is it just a coincidence that this year would fall exactly halfway through the 9th week of Enoch? Or is it possible that this is all accurate and the year 2025 or around there holds prophetic significance? Well, we're gonna have to talk about some more stuff. So to conclude the apocalypse of weeks, the Ethiopic version of Enoch says, "And after this, in the 10th week, in the 7th part, there shall be a great eternal judgment in which he will execute vengeance amongst the angels. And the first heaven shall depart and pass away, and a new heaven shall appear, and all the powers of the heavens shall give sevenfold light." That's Enoch 91:15 through 16. The Dead Sea Scroll version reads it like this: "And after that, the 10th week, in its 7th part, there will be eternal judgment and the moment of the great judgment, and he will carry out revenge in the midst of the holy ones. In it, the first heaven will pass away, and there will appear a new heaven, and all the forces of heaven will rise throughout all eternity, shining 7 times more. And that's 4Q Enoch 22b through 25a. So this clearly refers to the end of the kingdom age, the great white throne judgment, and the creation of a new heavens and a new earth. However, one small detail could be easy to overlook if we're not careful. Through the wording of the 10th week, we see an amazing detail about this entire prophecy. It is chiastically structured. And you know what? Where are we at? Oh man, okay, you know what? We are running out of time for this episode. We do have a lot more to talk about, including what happens after the apocalypse itself for believers and non-believers. But before we conclude, I really want to say, even if you don't believe a word from the book of Enoch, it is a tragic truth that there are many who will not heed the words of the Bible about life after death, who will choose the paths of unrighteousness by denying Christ, and who will perish forever without hope. For anyone listening, this does not have to be your fate. As long as there is breath in your lungs, there is still time to ensure your eternal security by putting your trust in Jesus Christ. And this is not achieved by works or by proving your own righteousness. Scripture tells us that God sees our righteousness as filthy rags, and you get that from Isaiah 64, verse 6. Instead, it's accomplished by accepting the free gift of salvation in Jesus through faith and allowing his righteousness to be credited to you. In making that decision, you can be assured that you will get to enjoy all the eternal gifts described in the final chapter of Revelation and elsewhere throughout the Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in closing, if you haven't already, I would highly encourage you to consider taking this chance today, right now, to accept God's gift of salvation through his Son, Jesus Christ. And if you have any questions about anything we've talked about in this video or anything else, feel free to email me at joshpeckdisclosure@gmail.com. All right, now, if you would like the rest of this video, including what Enoch's apocalypse of weeks says happens after the 10 weeks, and it is a beautiful, beautiful verse and a beautiful passage, and I can't wait to read it to you. But not only that, but what this chiastic structure of this entire prophecy means and what it tells us about the entire prophecy and our time today, which is really, really exciting. Head on over right now to dailyrenegade.com. Get a membership if you don't have one already, and you'll be able to watch the whole video there. Members not only get full videos that are not available anywhere else, and that's a necessity that we had to start doing because of censorship and shadow banning. We were having videos and entire channels deleted. So we have to do that. We have to do it this way. But also, you'll get early releases of all of our videos. So this video was, by the time you're watching this for free on YouTube, this video was actually released on the website yesterday. So people got this ahead of time. Sometimes you'll get it a week in advance. It just depends on what's going on. But every video, you get an early release. Memberships are only $10 a month or $100 a year. And I suggest doing the $100 a year if you can, because you're essentially getting 2 months for free. I also have a lot of big news and updates to share, but that will have to wait for another video since we are running out of time. If you are a member, please hang on the line. And everyone else watching for free on YouTube or elsewhere, thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, take care and God bless.